Imagine this. It's late at night. Your phone is inches from your face. You didn't plan to stay up this long, but somehow you're still here. Scrolling, refreshing, tapping. One more video, one more message, one more hit of something. You tell yourself you're tired, or bored, or just killing time. But beneath those explanations, there's a quieter question you rarely let yourself hear. What are you actually looking for? Because if this were only about pleasure, you would have stopped by now. If it were just habit, it wouldn't feel this necessary. And if it were just weakness, it wouldn't be happening to so many people at once. Yet here you are. Not just with your phone, but with food you don't need, with work you can't stop, with substances, relationships, fantasies, distractions, validation. Different forms, same pull. And here's the thought that unsettles most people the first time they hear it. You are not addicted because you are broken. You are addicted because something inside you is hurting and has learned that this is how it survives. That idea alone challenges almost everything you've been taught. You were told addiction is about self-control, about discipline, about learning to say no. So you try harder. You promise yourself this is the last time. You delete the app. You quit. You swear it off. And when you fall back into it, the shame returns. What's wrong with me? Why can't I just stop? But what if that entire framework is wrong? What if the real question is not, why am I addicted, but what pain am I trying not to feel? This is where Gabor Maté draws a line most people never cross. He doesn't ask, why the addiction? He asks, why the pain? And that question changes everything. Because suddenly, addiction is no longer a moral failure. It's not a character flaw. It's not a lack of willpower. It's a response, a coping strategy, a solution, just not a good one. Think about that. A solution implies a problem, and the problem didn't start when you picked up the substance, the behavior, or the habit. It started much earlier, before you had language for it, before you knew how to name what was missing, before you learned how or whether you were allowed to ask for what you needed. And that leads to a deeper, more uncomfortable question. What if addiction isn't the disease, but a symptom of a world that teaches you to disconnect from yourself? Look around. We live in a culture obsessed with stimulation and terrified of stillness. A culture that rewards productivity over presence, performance over authenticity, strength over vulnerability. You're expected to function, to adapt, to keep going. So you do. You learn to override discomfort, to suppress emotion, to stay productive even when something inside you is quietly collapsing. Until one day, something offers relief. Not joy, relief. Something that quiets the noise, something that fills the emptiness, something that gives you a brief sense of wholeness. And your nervous system remembers. This matters more than you think. Because addiction doesn't live in your logic, it lives in your body. It's not saying, this is good for me. It's saying, this makes the pain stop, even if only for a moment. That's why Gabor Maté insists addiction is not a choice, it's an adaptation. The nervous system always asks one question: what must I become in order to survive? Long before addiction shows up, you are already learning what is allowed. Which emotions are welcomed, which needs are inconvenient, which parts of you receive connection, and which parts quietly get ignored. This is where psychology and philosophy meet. Carl Jung spoke about the psyche's drive toward wholeness. When certain emotions or needs are rejected by family, culture, or circumstance, they don't disappear. They split off. They go underground. Jung called this the shadow. Not evil, just unlived life. And here's the part most people miss. Addiction doesn't come from the shadow itself.
It comes from the pain of carrying it alone. Because when a child learns that sadness makes others uncomfortable, that anger threatens connection, that vulnerability costs safety, the lesson is not intellectual, it's biological. The body learns feeling this is unsafe, so it adapts. Maté explains that addiction is rooted not in pleasure, but in attachment. A child doesn't need perfect parents. They need attuned ones. They need to feel seen, felt, mirrored, emotionally held, especially during stress. When that doesn't happen consistently, the child doesn't stay open forever. Eventually, they adjust. They become self-reliant too early. They dissociate. They numb. They learn to regulate themselves without help. And this is where philosophy deepens the picture. Nietzsche warned about what happens when vitality has nowhere to go, when instinct, emotion, and desire are suppressed not by force, but by necessity. Life becomes reactive.
Instead of desire, you get craving. Instead of meaning, stimulation. Instead of connection, intensity. Addiction is not excess pleasure. It's misdirected longing. The longing to be soothed, to feel safe, to feel whole inside your own body. But modern culture has no language for this. So it reframes addiction as weakness, as irresponsibility, as moral failure. And in doing so, it misses the mechanism entirely. Pain that cannot be expressed seeks relief. Relief that cannot be found relationally is sought chemically, behaviorally, symbolically. No drama, no judgment, just cause and effect. Neuroscience confirms this. Dopamine isn't about happiness. It's about anticipation of relief and safety. When early stress floods a developing nervous system without enough emotional buffering, the brain becomes hypervigilant, always scanning, always restless, always looking for something that will finally make things okay. Addiction plugs directly into that circuitry, not because it feels amazing, but because it quiets the alarm. This is why quitting alone rarely works. You can remove the substance, you can block the behavior, but if the disconnection remains, something else will take its place. Substance becomes work. Work becomes validation. Validation becomes control. Different masks, same hunger, and the consequences don't stay personal. Addiction quietly reshapes lives. It narrows emotional range. Joy feels suspicious. Stillness feels dangerous. Depth feels exhausting. Life becomes manageable, but small. Zoom out, and you see the same pattern everywhere. A society optimized for distraction, endless stimulation, constant noise. Not because people are lazy, but because silence brings you face to face with what's unresolved. And unresolved pain is inconvenient to a system that depends on productivity. So relief is commercialized. Distress is medicalized. Pain is privatized. You're encouraged to fix yourself quickly, quietly, without disturbing anything. A traumatized population is incredibly profitable because trauma creates need, and need fuels consumption. You don't just buy products, you buy regulation. Caffeine to wake up, alcohol to come down, media to distract, work to avoid. None of it feels extreme. That's why it works. Over time, agency erodes. You don't choose badly, you drift. You don't confront, you numb. And the deeper questions, who am I? What matters? What is worth suffering for? Get postponed indefinitely. Until one day, you realize you've been managing symptoms instead of living. This is why Maté insists addiction is not an individual problem. It's a relational one. And healing doesn't begin with control. It begins with reconnection. The real rebellion starts when you stop asking, "How do I quit?" and start asking, "What would make this unnecessary?" Healing doesn't begin with abstinence. It begins with compassionate curiosity. Not curiosity about the behavior, but curiosity about you. What's happening inside you before the craving appears? What emotion is there? What sensation? Instead of suppressing the urge, you listen. Because every addiction is trying to solve a problem. The substance is not the point. The behavior is not the point. Regulation is the point. You stop treating pain as something to eliminate and start treating it as something to understand. You slow down, not productivity slow, but nervous system slow. You practice staying with discomfort a little longer, staying with sadness without fixing it, staying with emptiness without filling it. And what often surfaces next is grief. Grief for what you didn't get. Grief for the version of you that learned to cope alone. Grief for years spent surviving instead of living. Grief is not regression. It's thawing. Then comes the relational shift. You let yourself be seen before you are healed. Not polished, not fixed. Now. Because addiction flourishes in isolation. Healing requires contact, not advice, not solutions. Presence. Someone whose nervous system can hold space for yours. Independence was the adaptation. Interdependence is the repair. And slowly, something changes. The urge still arises, but it no longer feels like a command. It feels like information. And in that pause, choice returns. Not because you're stronger, but because you're present. Which brings us to the final truth. Addiction was never the enemy. It was the language your nervous system used when nothing else was available. It was the solution you found when no one taught you a better one. Shame never heals addiction. It attacks the part of you that learned to survive. Compassion says, "Of course you did this. It makes sense." And when the nervous system feels understood, it no longer needs to scream. You were not born addicted. You were born open. Addiction is what happens when openness meets an environment that cannot receive it. So healing is not self-improvement. It is self-recovery. Not becoming better, but becoming whole. Wholeness doesn't mean eliminating pain. It means allowing every part of you to belong, including the part that numbed, including the part that craved, including the part that was afraid. When those parts are welcomed, they no longer need to hijack behavior. You don't heal addiction by fighting it. You heal addiction by listening to what it was protecting you from. That listening changes how you live. Stillness becomes possible. Feeling becomes safe. Presence replaces compulsion. The craving may still arise, but now there is space. And in that space, meaning returns. You stop trying to outrun yourself, and slowly, courageously, you begin coming home.